welcome to the Diversity Rocks podcast brought to you by Orchid, where our mission is striving for everyone at work and in society to feel like they belong. We want to disrupt the system. My name is Liz Critchley. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman in my late 40s, shoulder-length blonde hair with a fringe, and today I'm wearing an orange jumper. The topic of today's discussion is Let's Talk Autism, and I'm delighted to be joined today by the wonderful Charlie Hart. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, Liz.
Hi there. So let's start by getting to know you, Charlie. Tell us who you are and what your origin story is.
My name's Charlie Hart. I'm also known as Awesome Charlie with an AU for autistic. Like Liz, I'm a late 40s white woman with blonde hair, and behind me is my office wall, which is a countryside mural with a big rainbow. And thank you for having me, Liz. It's nice to be here.
You're very welcome.
So my origin story, I could talk about that for way longer than your whole podcast, but I'll give you some of the highlights. So when I grew up with a brother who was autistic and ADHD as well, and had learning disabilities. So to me, it was my only frame of reference for autism. And from quite a socially, economically disadvantaged background. So my mum struggled to hold down a job. My dad was an alcoholic. So they are very clever people, and I'm clever as well, and I kind of took after them. But everything was always a struggle for all of us. I didn't know that I was autistic. I knew I was a bit different, but I thought it was just because of my quirky family and having a disabled brother and stuff like that. But when I got to school, I was really quite different from the other kids. So I was quite a loner, but also like a serial monogamous best friend. So I'd adopt one person and talk to them for hours on end about my whatever my latest obsession was, and then they would do the same thing. And we didn't know what that was at the time, but now that I'm a member of the autistic adult community, I know it's about info dumping. But I was a clever kid at school, but I never did any homework. I was always getting into trouble. I had a lot of detentions, but the kids thought that I was square. I thought that meant a goody two-shoes and a teacher's pet, but actually they just meant that I wasn't very fashionable. So I was quite a target for bullies. And we had no uniform in that school either. So the trendy kids with the shell suits and the head bags, I'm showing my age now, they ruled the school. Those. Yeah, and anyone that didn't have all that stuff, that we were just unacceptable and not good enough and mercilessly picked on. So even when I got a shell suit, it was off the market. So that just made them worse. So I was quite weird and different, and I had very boyish hobbies like football and martial arts. I did taekwondo and solitary hobbies like bird watching, but no one thought anything of it. And then at A-level, I really started to struggle. I got through my A-levels because I've got a really good memory. But I was told I would drop at least a grade in every subject, which I did, and then really come unstuck when I got to university. Couldn't do any kind of self-directed study and learning, and I ended up floundering and dropping out. So I ended up with this like really difficult period where I was getting bullied a lot. I'd flunked uni, didn't know what I was going to do for a living. I was in an abusive relationship. My parents didn't know what the hell was going on with me. And I really floundered. But then I got a temping job in HR, and I discovered that I loved it. I'd got a passion for people, data and projects and analytics. I was getting involved with salary reviews. I learned to use Excel. I excelled at Excel. And then I went to night school, Coventry University Business School, and I did my certificate in personnel practice, and I became CIPD qualified. So that to me is the start of a long career in HR. So I was an HR analyst for 20 years, but struggling with meeting behaviours and small talk and saying the right thing to the right people, having the right influence and clout. So my colleagues were getting promoted over my head, and I wasn't getting the exceed ratings despite being a real high flyer and bending over backwards to impress people and help with things. And then eventually my son was diagnosed autistic, and I realised I was too. So that was 6 years ago now, 6 years ago this weekend. And that was a real pivotal role moment for me, because I then realized that there's a reason that I struggle with things that my peers take for granted. There's a reason I fell off the rails so hard at university, and there's a reason that I wasn't progressing in my career, trying to do it the same as everybody else. So I became really passionate about diversity and inclusion at that point. And now I'm self-employed and I talk about neurodiversity inclusion in the workplace.
I mean, that's not long ago, Charlie, about 6 years ago. How did that impact you, suddenly having that diagnosis later on in your
Yeah.
life as an adult?
Yeah, so it's not like it was a really quick journey to get there, because I'd had a 15-year period of trying to work out what the heck was wrong with my mental health, because I was constantly overwhelmed. The pressures of life were constantly exceeding my ability to cope, and every now and then I was getting hit with what I thought was clinical depression, where I struggled even with self-care, let alone going to work. And I was really closing in on myself. And I'd gone through therapy, I'd done CBT, taken antidepressants, practiced all the self-care. But every time I'd bounce back stronger, but then it would happen again. And I'd read this book, Adult Children of Alcoholics, and thought that explains everything. It talks about super responsibility, hypervigilance, all kinds of stuff. And I thought, that's it, that's me. But it's when my son was talking about how it felt to him when he experiences what he called an anxiety attack. And the psychiatrist said to him, that, yes, you're anxious, but that sounds like an autistic meltdown. Your anxiety is caused by the fact that you're autistic and you're going through life without the support that you need. And just as she was talking to him, all the pennies were dropping with me. And I thought, okay, great, I'm not broken. I'd been struggling with my mental health for so long. I really thought I was broken and that there was no hope for me. I thought I'd got bipolar, perhaps because of the cycles of hyperproductive and then crashing and getting depressed and then returning stronger. Turns out it's just autistic burnout. And then I'm bouncing back stronger because I've done the self-care, and that fixes burnout as well as depression. So yeah, it was hugely validating to me, and it explained a lot of the things that I struggled with, like saying the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time, people thinking that I was arrogant and abrasive and standoffish. My therapist said to me, there's a disconnect between your intent and how you come across. And I'd never felt so seen.
Mm-hmm.
So it was hugely validating to me. I joined the actually autistic community on Twitter, created the account Awesome Charlie with an AU for autistics, so that I could learn more about autism from first-hand personal experiences rather than from books or research or medical definitions. And I realized that a lot of the things where I thought I was broken and defective, they're common experiences and lots of people have them.
Yeah, great to talk about that and share and understand other people's perspectives. And what is it, Charlie? So you're self-employed now. I know you do a lot of talking about autism. Why in particular is talking about autism important to you?
Yeah, it's super important to me because I struggled for so long, both at school and through education and employment. But also my kids are autistic, so I want to help make the future better for them. But I've got complex PTSD and ADHD as well, but I think of autism as being my dominant neurotype, but there's a bit of conflict between the two at times. Like my ADHD likes a bit of novelty and excitement, and my autism likes things to be planned and prepared and predictable.
Quite the conflict then.
Yeah, but I just want things to be better for my daughters.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're aware, but I'd lost my son, who was 15, to suicide in 2019. So he was autistic, and it hasn't stopped me from advocating for autism acceptance. It hasn't stopped me being proud of being autistic, but it's given me a drive to make things better for my daughters, who are also autistic. One of them's diagnosed with severe combined ADHD as well. So yeah, I just want things to be better.
Yeah, and thinking about that from a workplace, so obviously you worked in HR for
Yes.
a lot of your career. What's your observation about that? What do workplaces need to be doing?
I'm quite uniquely placed here because I've been on both sides of the coin. So I've worked in HR for a long time, and although I wasn't in a generalist role, I was quite close to processes, and I saw requests come in and get turned around and reviewed. So when I found out I was autistic, I declared it at work straight away because I was in a privileged position where I felt pretty confident that I wouldn't be discriminated against, and that my employer does take reasonable adjustment requests seriously, and there's no kind of massive systemic disability discrimination going on. So I had that confidence, but I also knew how to advocate for my needs. I could understand the processes and the employment legislation, and I read a lot of the case law as well. So it uniquely positioned me. And there's things that my employer, that one and the subsequent one, did really well. And there's things where they just didn't go quite far enough. But I think, to me, you can look at the granularity of practical tips for neurodiversity inclusion, but what it really comes down to is the culture of psychological safety. If we feel safe, and we actually are safe, to be open about our struggles and our support needs, then we're able to thrive in our roles and do our best work. So it goes a lot further than just having some neuro inclusion policies and practices. It really comes down to culture.
Yeah, yeah, a really interesting. I agree. A lot of the work I do, I start by talking about culture with
Yeah,
organizations rather than diving straight into
yeah.
the diversity and the inclusion.
Because we're all human and we've all got our own needs. We've
Yeah.
got needs, preferences, things that we need to survive, to thrive.
Hmm.
And do you know what? The younger generation are really aware of that as well, because they've been brought up with access to information. They've learned about boundaries and expressing their wants and needs.
Hmm.
And they're going to expect to be accommodated at work, regardless of whether they're diagnosed with any kind of disability or neurodevelopmental difference.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, Charlie, in terms of the younger generation coming through. There's two things that occur to me. You mentioned that you had your diagnosis off the back of taking your,
My son,
and I
yeah.
think that is becoming more and more, increasing, is that
Yes.
parents are suddenly realizing, okay, what's going on with their children actually is true for themselves as
Yeah,
well.
it runs in the family. We don't lick it off the pavement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But also, I think the awareness is now increasing, which is great. That does mean, I think, that people are identifying different traits in themselves and
Yeah.
increasing their own awareness of how brains work in slightly different ways. And I wonder if you've got any views on that
Yes,
self-diagnosis or that self-identification of
absolutely.
some of the traits.
So, firstly, if somebody identifies with autistic traits or ADHD traits, I think that's a really positive thing, as long as they're not being flippant and dismissive with it.
Yeah.
So if you said to somebody, I really struggle with my working memory, and every time I go to a different room to get something, I forget. And they say, that happens to me too. It happens to us all. It's we're not all a bit ADHD. That's really rude and dismissive and flippant.
Yeah.
But if they said, now you mention it, I have problems with my working memory as well, and I keep picking up my phone and then not remembering what I've picked it up for. I never know where I've put my keys, that kind of thing. And it's something that happens a lot, and they realize that they could have a neurodevelopmental difference, they could have support needs, then that to me is only a positive thing. So
Hmm.
it all depends how it sort of lands with them and how they respond to it. When people read my social media content, because I've got a neurodiversity page on Facebook and I'm really active on LinkedIn as well, and I post relatable content, and if people like that and they read every post and think, but that's everyone, then
Yeah.
those people really need to think, is it, or is it me? In terms of autism, there is so much information, there are so many books, and there isn't any adult who decides that they're autistic without doing a lot of research, reading the books, reading the social media, and looking at the traits, and then analysing their own traits and their own behaviours and their own internal experiences. It always comes from research, retrospection, and introspection. So it's a lot more thorough than what you would get if you just spoke to a doctor about it or something.
Yeah.
So I absolutely think self-diagnosis is valid for autism. The only thing is that you might miss things. So I'm autistic and ADHD, and I have complex PTSD. When I realised I was autistic, yeah, I went for diagnosis. Yes, I was right, but it didn't answer everything. So I really could have done with a more holistic approach.
Yeah.
But I got there on my own with a few more years and a bit of thinking. Actually, this doesn't explain everything, and I'm really struggling to focus on the elements of my university work that are not particularly interesting to me. I've got a really highly interest-based motivation system, and then I find out that I've got inattentive ADHD as well.
Yeah, I hear a lot of people using the term autistic in a very passing manner. Oh, that's so me, I'm so autistic, or,
Yeah.
oh, don't be so autistic, if someone does something, and it irritates me. I can only imagine how
Yeah.
you would feel when you hear that, because it can sometimes
It
come across as
depends.
belittling. And
Yeah. If somebody was using it as a general insult, it would bother me. But like, me and my husband say that to each other, and we know, he's diagnosed ADHD and he's been assessed for autism, but told that he doesn't quite meet the diagnostic threshold. But we both know that he's somewhere on the spectrum. It's pretty undeniable to anyone that's ever met him that he's both. But if he requires a lot of planning and information, and it could be like looking at Google Street Views before driving to a gig, so that he can check out the parking situation and the loading situation for he's in a band, so he's got to think about how to get his equipment into the venue. He'll have a look on Google Street View, and to me that is really autistic. And I'll tell him that.
yeah, there's a fine line, isn't there, between, as with a lot of inclusion language, a fine line between talking to people well about things, perhaps using humor to try and get through the day, versus not saying things that could be offensive if there's other people around you.
I mean, I try not to give people labels that they haven't adopted for themselves. So, and I've got you'll have heard me describe myself as autistic rather than saying that I have autism.
Yes.
But I do have adult friends who are diagnosed as children, and they are more likely to say that they have autism or that they're on the spectrum, because that's just what they were used to. And it's a more recent thing that we've shifted away from person first language, and people who are diagnosed autistic as an adult, they're more likely to embrace the neurodiversity paradigm and to take autistic as a positive label. It is integral to who we are because it's how our brain is wired. It couldn't be more descriptive, so I just use the adjective.
Yeah, and let's talk a bit more about that. So last year I did a course, a level 2 understanding autism, very much written from a medical perspective. So the terminology used was autistic spectrum condition or autistic spectrum disorder. And it strikes me, so you mentioned the paradigm there. On your recommendation, I read the book. And I found it fascinating. Tell us a little bit more about that shift from medicalized conversation and ways of thinking into, well, you tell us. You'll articulate it better than me.
In disability activism as a whole, we can look at a difference between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. So the medical model of disability comes from the perspective that there's something wrong with the person and that we need to try and fix them. And the social model of disability accepts the person for who they are, but it's saying that the environment is not as accessible as it could be. So that's kind of the start of it. But then taking it a bit further, when we're looking at neurodivergence, there's this paradigm, the neurodiversity paradigm, and neurodiversity means that it acknowledges that all human brains and minds are unique, that we all think, feel, and process the world in unique ways. And the neurodiversity paradigm says, yes, all brains are unique, and that isn't a bad thing. It doesn't mean that some of them are good and some of them are broken or bad or defective. It's just a natural part of diversity, like biodiversity in nature. So biodiversity is advantageous to the ecosystem, and so is neurodiversity in human populations. That to me, I started to think, okay, I'm not broken, then there's not something wrong with my brain. It's different, and I need to approach certain things like work and relationships and social gatherings and things like that in a slightly different way and advocate for my needs.
Yeah, and that's what I loved so much about the concept of it, particularly from an inclusion at work perspective, is actually just treat everybody as an individual with their own particular needs, and it doesn't necessarily matter whether there's a formal diagnosis or not. 9 times out of 10, the adjustments that people would help people are very inexpensive, very little time resource. They require little tweaks, and therefore why wouldn't you just do that if you can accommodate that within the working environment?
So it's a complete no-brainer for me. If there's little changes you can make that will help people to thrive in their roles, it's a no-brainer. You make those changes because then you're going to get the best work out of that person. They'll be off sick less, they'll stay longer, they'll be more engaged, more committed. Absolute win-win. But also, and this is just for the UK, the disability is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, yes, but you don't need a diagnosis to be able to identify as being disabled under the Equality Act. So likewise, you don't need a diagnosis in order to be protected from unfair discrimination or to request reasonable adjustments. It can be helpful as a piece of evidence if you ended up in a tribunal, but it doesn't depend on that, on having that diagnosis. And that's important because diagnosis is a privilege denied to many. So it's an absolute minefield to work through the process. And a lot of us have to go private as well. So you need the means, you need the money, you need the influence. And then for certain marginalized groups, so Black women, for instance, I've got autistic Black women friends who've said to me, it's even harder to get a diagnosis if you're Black because they just think that you're an angry Black kid rather than looking to see if there's a neurodevelopmental difference that you need support with.
I think a lot about the system. So there's lots that we can do as individuals. For hundreds and hundreds of years, this system has created itself around us with things in it that we just don't always question, that we just take for granted that we've grown up with. And I wonder if there's 1 or 2 things that you think are broken with the system or need changing with the system in particular to make autistic people feel more included in the world.
I think we're already taking baby steps in the right direction. So what was always bonkers to me before the pandemic, commuting in rush hour, that was so not inclusive to anyone who is socially awkward or anxious. So I started to work from home 2 days a week, and due to the nature of the job I was doing as an HR analyst, it wasn't that customer facing and sometimes needed to have big chunks of time head down buried in a spreadsheet. So I was allowed to do that. But then with the pandemic, we saw a lot of people working from home and then returning on a hybrid basis. So already we've proven that we don't have to be in the office 9 to 5 with people watching what we're doing, that we can be very productive when we're allowed to just get on with it in our own time, in our own environment.
Yeah, it's good. There was a lot of good things actually that came out of the pandemic in terms of ways of working.
And I was at SRA at the time, and the Working Parents Network was our biggest ERG. So SRA is about 2/3 female, and over half of the staff were in the Working Parents Network. So there we were able to, we had monthly catch-ups, but there was a group chat as well. And we were able to talk about the things we were struggling with in terms of schools being shut and us having work to do, and some of our concerns around our kids when we went back to the office and things like that. And that caused a massive shift in people expecting work to fit in around them and their kids and their lives rather than the other way around.
Oh, well, thanks so much for chatting to us today. One of the things that Diversity Rocks is all about is increasing our awareness and changing perception. So I think we've definitely done that today. And as part of that, I love the concept of paying it forward somehow. I know that there'll be listeners who are thinking, well, what can I do to help, whether that be in change of behaviour or monetary or, you know, contributions. So I'd like to give you the opportunity if there's anything that you would like to ask for from our audience.
Yes, so I've got a blog called Allyship Tips for Working with Neurodivergent Colleagues, which I'll share with you. If you could all have a look through that, it's mostly written from my perspective, so it isn't going to be the be all and end all, but it's a good place to start. But accepting us for who we are is the real big thing. So yeah, if we say that, for me, it's an aircon usually. If there's an air conditioning noise and it's rumbling at a frequency that's making me feel uncomfortable, I'm not just being a Karen about this. I genuinely need to move. So it's about listening to us and believing us.
Yeah.
And accept us for who we are rather than trying to do some coaching on interpersonal skills and trying to make us more neurotypical, because these neuronormative standards are really not helping anyone. We need to be able to embrace who we are and lean into our strengths.
A perfect example to end there, Charlie, on one of my bugbears. Let's stop trying to change the person and let's change the system around the person.
Absolutely. And I've got a lot of young friends from marginalised groups who talk particularly well about this, and a lot of them are listed on I've got a recommendations page called Club Autism. A lot of them are listed there. So I'm trying to help young emerging speakers get into spaces where their voices are not often enough heard, and not as a novelty item, and not always on an intersectionality panel either. Let's give them keynote speeches. Let's give these people work.
Okay, let's try and do that then, Charlie. Let's have a look at the list and see whether there's just somebody out there listening to this that has a conference or an event coming up, and we can get one of those keynote speakers on there. That sounds like a good objective. Excellent, lovely. Thanks so much for your time today, Charlie. It's been really insightful and interesting. All the very best, and hopefully speak to you soon.
Thanks, Liz.
Cheers.
See you soon.